for the introduction. It's really wonderful to be here. I was unprepared for the mic that they've got around my head, so I'm thinking this should be more of a Tony Robbins-inspired sort of session, but I can't go anywhere. I can't run around the stage asking everyone to be their best selves or something like that. So I'll stick to my talk. It's really, truly wonderful to be here. My thanks to Terry and all the organizers for pulling us together in this beautiful place. I have two objectives for the talk this morning. The first is to frame a current period of rural development and outline some implications for workforce development. And the second is to talk about some of the opportunities for rural development that will support attraction, retention, and durability of the 21st century workforce. And my argument's based on a couple of points. From the proposal, we see that innovation is understood as a community-based collective learning process. And I think Terry talked about that in her opening remarks. You know, this is a highly collaborative endeavor, and that theme will certainly be prevalent in the talk, in my comments this morning. I argue that in order for that to happen, the fundamentals of rural development have to be working seamlessly in this region, and that workforce development in the 21st century means that development has to be highly integrated. It has to be built from a foundation of coordinated functional regionalism, and it has to be highly participatory. All of those things have to be happening together in order to build the type of rural community at the bottom end of the screen, and not the picture that you see in the top of a mobile work camp, which is certainly one of the alternatives. This is a difficult task, right? We shouldn't underestimate the work that we have ahead of ourselves. The great news, though, for all of you here in the Kootenays, is that you're already really leaders in this area. You know, the fact that we're here today is a testament to that. You have an extraordinary amount of fantastic research and information about yourselves due to the work of the RDI and the Columbia Basin Trust, and that is just a tremendously huge asset for engaging in this type of work. And we should, you should all feel very proud about that. We're really starting this endeavor from a surplus position. My own research relationship with the Kootenays goes back about 10 years with some work on the social economy. And the SFU Community Economic Development Program has done a couple of Kootenay cohorts that I've had an opportunity to teach in. And it's just a wonderful opportunity for me to learn about the amazing people in this region and some of the incredible development activities taking place. This is an incredibly beautiful part of the world, and that is not unimportant in the work and the task that we have set out for ourselves here today in terms of seeking to attract and retain a high-quality workforce into the region. So where to start? Well, let's start with the people of the region, the workforce. 86% of Kootenay residents say they love where they live. That's an extraordinarily high number. Most predict they will stay. 93% of residents say that this is a great place to live. You have a 77% volunteer rate. 74% say the access to arts and culture is good or very good. And 86% report having a very high positive sense of well-being. That's it, really. You know, you're going to be fine. We can start. I'm not sure what we're going to do for the rest of the afternoon, but thank you very much for inviting me. It was a wonderful opportunity to meet all of you, and I look forward to the rest of the day.
No. Wait a minute.
What?
You owe me another 45 minutes.
45 minutes. This is it. This is it from a rural development perspective. 45 minutes.
Includes Q&A.
Okay, good. I hope people are writing down lots of questions. Okay, thanks, Terry, for participating in that. But I do actually want to pause and reflect on this number for a minute. It's extremely powerful. I've traveled, crisscrossed this province, traveled to dozens of communities, talked to hundreds of people in this province and across Canada. And I want you to know how truly rare and precious this type of love of place is and how powerful it can be. People throughout the province love their communities. There's no doubt about that, and there's some beautiful places in this province. But that absolute strong place-first approach to living and choosing where to live is incredibly powerful, and it's also very rare. It is, of course, the core ethos of Indigenous communities, but it also illustrates a maturation of the development foundation of settler communities from being simply places to secure work, moving on to the next mill, where to go after the next bust, to creating real community and complete communities. So if Terry says I have 40 odd minutes left, I might as well keep going, and this is what I'd like to talk about for the rest of the session. Why are we engaging in a workforce strategy? How did we get here? Provide a little bit of sort of back context and a little bit of policy context. I would like to sort of take a kick at presenting a theory of change for our work together, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Talk about some of the strategic foundations that we can employ in our workforce development strategies and rural development. These are things that we can control, or that are more in our realm of control, and then talk about some of the structural foundations as well for our workforce strategy, the things that we might not necessarily be able to control, but that we can influence, and ask some questions along the way. So, don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. As I mentioned, my family doesn't want to leave. But why are we here? And why are we doing this? This is a subtle yet important question. We must always challenge rural development interventions with the question, would this be happening anyway? That doesn't mean we have to roll over to the mystical reassurance of a laissez-faire approach to market fundamentalism, but it does mean that we have to challenge ourselves, be very clear in our motivations for intervention, and have a very strong theory of change about what we're doing. If we do X, then Y will happen. So I'll return to that theory of change in a minute. And these are some of the bigger trends that I'd like to just spend a few minutes talking about. The first, of course, is that rural Canada has a people problem, not a job problem. Our colleague Ray Bowman, formerly with Statistics Canada, likes to remind people about this. You have a labor replacement ratio in the region of about 0.51 to 0.76, meaning that you have a people problem, not a job problem. From one of your studies, you outlined that the boomer cohort aging and birth rate decline, the North American population as a whole is aging. However, the issue is particularly relevant in our region, where the seniors population is projected to grow by 42% over the next 20 years, and the size of the working age population is projected to decline by 7%. So this is a real serious issue. Greg Halseth, who spoke here last fall, I believe, talked more about this, and you have his video of his talk, an excellent talk on the RDI website. But this is essentially the phenomenon. You have an aging demographic moving its way not just through Canada, but in particular workforce aging taking place in rural areas across the country. The second phenomenon, of course, is that technology replaces jobs. This is true for all different types of sectors in the economy. And when combined with the fact that older workers are working longer with more seniority, it's leading to tremendous amounts of youth out-migration. There's another connection here to technology replacing jobs, that if you're in a resource-dependent economy, particularly one with more low-value production mechanisms, your job technology overall job levels will just continue to decline. So we have to be really careful about the type of jobs that we're seeking to facilitate into the region. A third dynamic is aging infrastructure, and this concerns our ability to compete for people and capital in the new economy. There's been a complete lack of an investment mentality and vision at both provincial and senior government levels in this province and across the country over the past 30 years. We see this in aging infrastructure, closed offices and services, downloaded responsibilities, and piecemeal approaches to funding and programming. So right at the point at which we are stepping into a new economic reality, a much more competitive economic reality for people and capital, our infrastructure is entering the end of its life stage. And it's a tremendous challenge, particularly for local municipalities. And it also means that as new economic opportunities arise, we will be slower to capture the benefits from them. So that's a significant concern. A fourth factor is that the region has lower but still very high levels of poverty. From the First Call report on child poverty, it points out that 1 out of 5 children in this province is poor. That's 163,260 children in this province live defined as poor. If you put them all in one place, they'd be the 5th largest town in the province. It's a very significant problem. 50% of BC children are being raised by single parents, primarily single mothers. We lack a provincial poverty reduction plan, which makes it that much more difficult for regions to address this issue. I note and reviewed the Columbia Basin Trust Social Strategic Plan, so it's wonderful that you have that, and of course you are already considering these types of things in the region. But it represents a tremendous loss of capacity and creating conditions of cycle of poverty that a workforce strategy could certainly be doing something about. A fifth dynamic is this phenomenon of perpetual planning. I know everyone's just thrilled to hear that. We're never going to actually get to stop planning. This rather boring-looking figure on the chart right there is 3-month rolling averages for employment in the Northeast sector. And what the takeaway from that is that this sort of, we certainly do experience longer sort of 5 to 7 year patterns of boom and bust in resource sectors. But the dynamics of how that's expressing itself at the community level, the type of challenges that municipalities in particular are dealing with and regions are dealing with, happen in a much more rapid way. We need much more rapid response mechanisms in our planning and an ability to sort of keep going. This sort of can't sit still. Anyone familiar with the movie Touching the Void, book Touching the Void, about climbing? And there's that scene in the film where Joe Simpson gets lowered basically into a crevasse. And the rope gets cut because his partner is running out of time and energy. And he's injured, so he realizes he can't climb out of the crevasse. So he's just hanging there. He's kind of wondering what to do. So he decides to climb down. And he says, you gotta make decisions. You gotta keep making decisions, you know. If you don't make decisions, you're stuffed. So there's a lesson there for rural communities that we have to keep making decisions. We have to keep engaging in the process. If people are averse to change or fearing change, it's something that's happening without you, right? So you can either participate in the process or not. And rural towns have to keep making decisions, something that we're going to be doing here today. So the second sort of range of reasons for why we are engaging in this process, why intervention in workforce issues, have to do with the realities of the modern work environment. And the first phenomenon that I want to talk a little bit about is this emerging sort of notion of precariat. Guy Standing, who's a professor at the University of London, says there's a new class whose voice will soon be at the center of Canadian life. It is the precariat, the growing mass of Canadians who are in precarious work, precarious housing, and holding precarious citizenship, perpetual part-timers, the minimum wagers, the temporary foreign workers, the grey market domestics paid in cash, the young Canadians who will never have secure employment, the techno-impoverished whose piecemeal work has no office and no end. The precariat consists of millions of people struggling to come to terms with lives of unstable labor and unstable living, lacking an occupational identity or career. They rely on money wages, which are stagnant and volatile, putting them in constant fear of unsustainable debt. The politicians have ignored the precariat, which may account for 40% of the adult population in Canada. So that's a sobering sort of description of a whole class of workers or potential workers in the country. And I think in a rural context, it's something, I don't have stats on this, but I can argue probably relatively convincingly that we're overrepresented. Rural workforce and people in the rural areas are overrepresented in that precariat, given that we have lower overall wages in some sectors, less overall economic diversification, less access to services, lower levels of education, and access to education. So that precariat is a rural phenomenon of workforce development that we have to be very mindful of. Second condition up there is uncertainty about rural investment. If rural communities are shrinking, why would we invest in them? That statement is completely false, of course. Rural communities are growing across this country. They're growing more slowly than urban areas. But that thinking, that perception is a very, very prominent understanding of rural places, particularly in the capitals of our provinces and capital cities of the country. And it's a tremendous problem, impeding adequate investment in rural places. And not just at an institutional level and at senior government level, but this affects very personal and family decisions as well. People are sort of, that's the common perception about rural places. Then people are asking themselves, should we stay? Should we purchase a house here? Will the resource economy hold? Will there be quality services and education for our children? Will there be amenities and dance programs and soccer programs for our children? Good education. And that fundamentally affects our ability to attract residents and retain residents in rural regions. The third type is really sort of an understanding of what type of work people actually want. That's a crazy question. In terms of the next generation workforce, I think at most we see sort of businesses and governments whinging about Generation Y and how they don't really want to work hard and expect the corner office after their 6-month internship is over. And while some of that characteristics might be true, I think it goes tremendously deeper than that. Maybe it actually has to do with new considerations of work-life balance, using skills and continuous learning, and being part of work that's meaningful. Next generation workforce is looking for a net calculation that is positive in the world, an outcome for the world and the environment. And then lastly here is an understanding of why live rural at all. What is well-being in a rural and remote setting, and how can a workforce strategy support that? The State of Rural Canada, which is a publication put out by the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation in 2015, a whole bunch of us in this room worked on that document. There's a really interesting section on it from New Brunswick, and that's sort of really fundamentally asking this question of the rural population and the rural development strategies, and in some ways sort of taking a different approach on that sort of growth mantra, right? That if we're not growing, we're dying, by fundamentally asking this question, well, what does it mean to live rural? Why do people want to live rural? And that's a challenging question. Local councillors will get beat up, figuratively, at the ballot box if they sort of challenge that growth mantra. Planners hate introducing that concept into councils. So we're not particularly good at asking these types of questions. But when we link it to well-being, it opens up a whole new avenue for having a discussion about why people want to choose to live in rural places. So with some of that background context in place, and I'm hopefully what that's done is built a bit of a rationale for why we're engaging in this work and to justify the intervention, I want to talk about some sort of quick 3 phases from a policy perspective, focusing primarily on the third one that I'll get to in just a second, because it creates opportunities for communities and regions. These 3 areas of development, sort of the long boom period, 1950 to 1980s, intense period of restructuring that we've just sort of seemed to be sort of coming out of a little bit, the 1980s into the early 2010s, and then where we are now. For those of you that are interested in a much more in-depth look at this, Sarah Breen's PhD dissertation does a really nice job with this. If anyone wants to plow through a 168-page PhD thesis, I highly recommend it. It's fantastic reading. Okay, so let's talk about the 1950s. BC was a have-not province in the 1950s. I was driving north from Prince George a few weeks ago, and we were reminded, sitting in the car, like, this road didn't exist in the 1950s. Right? That is not that long ago, right? Our resource industries were tremendously inefficient. We weren't capturing a lot of economic benefit from them. And enter the fellow up in the top right corner there, W.A.C. Bennett, who implemented a period of very intense investment in this province, captured around a vision of extracting resources and getting them out to foreign markets. But he did it in a way that I think there's some lessons that we can learn about. One, he had a vision of where he wanted to take the province, and he stuck to it. Secondly, there was coordinated investments taking place. So while they were building the economic infrastructure on one side, they were also investing heavily in social infrastructure. And that has a lot to do with maybe the type of industry at the time, creating industrial stability, but they were building real, complete communities at the same time. And thirdly, that they were unafraid to invest. They saw the opportunities and they went with it. There are, of course, and this led to a period known as the long boom. Bloom works too, actually, for that typo. Tremendous amounts of population growth, economic activity taking place in every corner of the province. There are, of course, challenges with this area. I don't want to get overly nostalgic. Of course, the complete alienation and marginalization of indigenous communities during this period from economic activity. Ecological problems associated with the industrial activity that were taking place. And also, we really sort of locked us in a path-dependent way on low-value, high-volume resource commodity production that we've had a hard time getting away from. But nevertheless, there are some lessons from that period that I think we should heed. The second phase of intense political and economic restructuring is you sort of see what happened primarily to the rural areas of the province during the last 30 years. Tremendous amounts of population shifts, downloading of responsibility from senior governments, a general sort of severing of a sense of stewardship from industry to communities that has created tremendous amounts of problems for rural and small town places. All of this change, of course, taking place without a complementary shift in resources or capacity to support rural communities as they were going through this transition. So rural communities, I think, for the most part during this period, that 80s to sort of early 2010s period, were left on their own. A local mayor talked to me about some of the offloading up north that was taking place in the region. He said, I don't really like to talk about it as offloading so much as just completely vacating the field. It's not out of the way. And the chart there sort of describes that phenomenon a little bit in terms of the increasing financial burden being placed on municipalities in terms of dealing with the broad spectrum of investments associated with development periods. And the third period that we're in, and it's a little hard to sort of say this because we're right in the middle of it right now, right? But my colleagues Greg Halseth and Laura Reiser, we've been sort of trying to capture this as a period of reactionary incoherence for a variety of reasons. One is that there's a little bit of that mixed nostalgia for the past, those W.A.C. Bennett period, in terms of should senior governments just invest in their own? A very confused ideology of intervention, stuttered reactionary investments in programs that have taken place over the years. Everything's sort of short-term, piecemeal, small grants. Everyone killing themselves for $20,000 in funding. And associated with that is sort of an intense politicization of investments, right? When it's not being guided by any particular sort of vision or strategy, it's just happening in a very politicized way in pockets around the province. There are, however, opportunities associated with this current confused period. I'm not just talking about sort of the stasis moment that our provincial government's in, right? This is a much broader phenomenon. And one is that there is actually a need and a recognized need for reinvestment, primarily in critical infrastructure, and we've sort of seen that from across the political spectrum over the last number of years. And secondly, and most importantly, is that communities and regions themselves have an unprecedented opportunity to influence the direction of their own development future and trajectories. After 30, 40 years of restructuring, the knowledge base and boots on the ground that provinces and senior governments have in rural areas is extraordinarily low. They don't really know what's happening out here, right? So that is a problem, but it is also a tremendous opportunity if communities and regions can actually get organized, come up with their own plan, and work together to implement it. That will be received, I think, very positively by senior governments to go, oh, okay, that's what you want to do? Okay, let's try to make that happen, right? So it is as confusing and as reactionary and as everyone is sort of wishing that we could move to a more proactive footing. We're still in this sort of fuzzy zone. But it can be a real opportunity, and I would like to see it be an opportunity to sort of redirect some of the resources associated with this sort of concept of rural regions being a resource bank, right? Which is capital cities just sort of plugging in a Hoover up into the rural resource regions and sucking resources out and not making adequate reinvestments. I think there's an opportunity for reinvestments to be taking place. Going back to that State of Rural Canada report, I think just importantly, it's important for regions to know that they're not alone. The type of sort of issues that you are dealing with and struggling with are common to rural regions right across the country. That said, rural places are tremendously resilient. Resources and ecological services that are going to become increasingly important in the 21st century. Employment opportunities, untapped opportunities associated with rural and urban interdependence. Tremendous social ties, commitment to place, and a very strong and young Aboriginal youth cohort. They are also struggling with similar patterns of neglect, from the lack of an investment mentality, a preference for market-oriented solutions that tend to miss the way that rural development works, right, in a much more coordinated and collaborative fashion, and a rundown of core infrastructure. So as we make this step, we're doing so on perhaps not the most stable of footing. And it's going to affect all, I'm putting up 4 different dimensions of rural economy here that we can focus our workforce strategy on. One is sort of continued resource sector employment that will continue to be important, particularly in this province. With in mind that technology will continue to replace jobs and we will continue to go through major booms and bust patterns associated with global market forces. A second economy is a place-based economy, community resource management, an emphasis on service sector. These are this ultimate sort of disconnect between place and workplace, but it can be an opportunity for rural regions as well, right? If you're an attractive place to be, families want to live here, then you become a home base for mobile workers. And equally so, workforce strategies should take that into account and actually have policies in place to help mobile workers and their families to continue to be part of the community. And in all of these 4 economies, the demand for amenities will increase. There's demand for increased connected communities, both in terms of hard and electronic infrastructure that I'm sure Wayne will be telling us more about in a minute, and really leveraging the assets of a rural and small town place. Okay, so that brings me to my theory of change. I'm going to take a shot at it. I hope everyone's familiar with this concept of theory of change. I think it's important when engaging in these types of activities, right? Like, what's our theory, right? We're all here. We're going to be coming up with plans. What's going to happen if we do what we say we're going to do by the end of the day? That's essentially what the theory of change articulates. The first is that we need to recognize the competing interests of capital, senior governments, and communities and regions. Capital is in charge of really defending and pursuing the interests of shareholders, right? That may align nicely with communities and regions, and perhaps it might not. Senior governments must protect and promote the broader public interest, whether it's provincial or federal, and again, that may align nicely with the strategy at community and regional level, and in other times it will be at cross purposes. And thirdly, that communities and regions, their job is to protect and promote the citizens who live here. Secondly, that we need to place an emphasis on the allocation of our resources and capacity on things that we can control. That doesn't mean we also have to come up with strategies for intervention and thinking about ways that we deal with external forces, senior governments, market forces, and that type of thing. But the bulk of our activity and resources should go towards things that we can control. And thirdly, and most importantly, that a regional unity of vision and collaboration is critical to leverage the benefits and mitigate the impacts associated with political and economic restructuring and design a workforce strategy going into the 21st century. So on that same trip going north a few weeks ago, a local mayor told me that industry and government just loved when communities in the region were fighting. They just loved it because they just picked them apart, right? And what is much, much more powerful is when the communities within a region are working together and presenting a common voice and scale of their impact. Okay, so what are some of the strategic foundations that we can work towards? First is the local economy. Michael Schumann, who teaches in our program, talks about the 3 rules for local prosperity: maximizing local ownership, maximizing local self-reliance, and spreading models of triple bottom line success. So how do existing businesses fit into your workforce development strategy? Local businesses deliver more than double the local economic impact multiplier. They're competitive, profitable, good investments, and have a whole bunch of other spin-off benefits in terms of community planning, tourism, and community health. Maura Walsh, who runs a regional development agency in Ireland. It's Ireland, right, Ryan? She spoke at a surf conference a couple of years ago talking about local economic development, and she's like, why is it always about the jam? And she used an expletive, which I won't use because she'd get away with it. Beautiful Irish lilt, right? And you'll just think I'm rude if I said something like that. She's like, why is it always about the jam? Like, why can we not engage senior planners and governments and our own communities in thinking bigger about what rural local economies can be? Manufacturing, high-tech economies, right? And personally, I love the jam. I like the jam too, right? It's part about a complete community and entrepreneurial opportunities for families, being part and offering local products. but she was really challenging us to think bigger about what local economies could be in rural and small town places. Secondly is that we need to adopt a whole economy approach. If your business development strategy or business retention and expansion program is only focused on the economic development side of this equation, and you are missing the foundations, community foundations upon which those strategies take place, you will not be successful. So how do these foundational elements fit into our regional workforce strategy? Third is to push more heavily on this idea of regionalism. Terry mentioned it in her introductory comments. We've been talking a lot about collaboration, but what does this mean? Well, I mean, it's come into popularity for a variety of reasons. One, restructuring that I talked about, right? Communities are simply having to work together in terms of pooling resources. But we're also finding tremendous economic competitiveness advantages. The importance of these so-called soft social processes, or things that used to be sort of considered soft, are actually tremendously important. And the importance of territorial planning. So not sort of taking just sort of a sectoral approach to jobs, but thinking about, well, how do those sectors operate in the region? How do they relate and interconnect within the region? And that, I think, is something, an incredibly important lesson, particularly as we move into a conversation around clusters, for example. Findings from a Canadian regional development project that many of us in this room participated in found that we have sort of relatively weak regionalist structures in this country. We tend to continue a siloed-based approach to doing development rather than more territorial and collaborative. There's jurisdictional tensions that we have to navigate and a lack of capacity for co-construction. What that means is that we talk a lot about top-down, bottom-up cooperation, but we're not very good at it yet. Communities and within regions generally are not working as well as they could be together. There's sort of this reluctant cohesion to engaging in regionalism. Economic development is still seen as a zero-sum competitiveness enterprise. There are historical patterns for this. You know, one's a mine town, one's a mill town, one's a hydro, one's a tourism, and they've just never really had to work together before. And we're having to do that now. Findings from our work around regional development in this region and from some of the other reports that I reviewed before coming here talked about the tremendous assets of regional institutions that you have here, the CBT and the Rural Development Institute, that there are regionalist initiatives taking place around investment, local purchasing, and infrastructure. Commitment to place is very strong, but it tends to be much more community-oriented rather than sort of regionally oriented, which is important. The region can be quick to mobilize, but is still operating from more of a reactionary footing. Organizations are mentioning that they are overcommitted, right? Which means that elasticity or the capacity for collaboration is probably weak. And there's a lack of trust in the region, which is hindering innovation and collaboration. And that might just simply have to do with sort of places that are resource poor tend to be much more intense, but it also speaks to that history of collaboration. So how can we improve regional working relationships at all levels to support and engage a workforce development strategy implementation, ultimately what we're doing here today? Fourth is I mentioned poverty. The beginning and poverty reduction strategy, I think, is a huge part and can be a huge part of workforce development. What percentage of your regional workforce is not being employed to high capacity? What percentage of your youth population is struggling in poverty? Single parents, primarily women-led families, are being trapped in cycles of poverty. So these are all issues that I know that you're engaged in, some of your reports around living wages, housing, and childcare. But how does poverty reduction fit into our regional workforce development strategy? These are resources that are here now, not necessarily having to attract. It's just a matter of sort of how to employ them and work with them more effectively. A fifth strategy is reconciliation. This quote comes from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. For over a century, the central goals of Canada's Aboriginal policy were to eliminate Aboriginal governance, ignore Aboriginal rights, terminate the treaties, and through a process of assimilation, cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities in Canada. The establishment and operation of residential schools were a central element of this policy, which can best be described as cultural genocide. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is really an invitation for all of us to acknowledge and address these wrongs. From a development perspective, First Nations throughout this province and across the country, there's tremendous opportunities of strong youth cohorts, improving standards of education, prospects for title and treaty, and with it, strong commitments to localism and regionalism, and values of place, sustainability, and long-term planning. And a lack of Aboriginal outreach and participation has been noted in a variety of research findings from the region. So there's an opportunity here. Just to share a story from my own university, SFU hosted a community university conference a couple of months ago, and an Indigenous leader from the Lower Mainland was speaking at one of the evening plenaries. And he just openly questioned whether or not reconciliation was even possible with an institution the size of SFU, right? Which is, it's a pretty hard, it's a hard thing to hear. Our president was in the audience. It's a huge part of our vision and strategy. And just to fundamentally question whether or not it was possible, given the history, the scale, and sort of the colonial roots of the institution, I think was a very honest and intense comment. And what he did speak about is, whether or not that was possible, but what we could do is create what he called spaces of dignity for Indigenous participation within the university. So that's perhaps a function of this project, or that this project could pursue as well. So what is the role of reconciliation and workforce planning in this region? Moving on to some of the structural foundations, these are things that we have less control over but can still influence. First is to demand more from senior governments. This picture is, that's the hill. Anyone driven the hill down to Bella Coola? From the plateau down to Bella Coola? You made it. Oh, well done. Good work. Good driving. That's what it looks like today in the winter. I might snowshoe down that hill. I don't think I'd drive down it. But I use it as a bit of an analogy for sort of a lack of an investment mentality. This road is the only thing that connects thousands of people. A couple of thousand people from the Bella Coola Valley up to the mainland. And that's how much work we've done on the road in the last sort of 60, 70 years. We have to employ senior governments in addressing some of the market failures associated with restructuring. And again, given that period of reactionary incoherence, I think there's real opportunities for communities and regions to take the lead on that. So how do we effectively engage with senior governments from a proactive position of understanding regional goals and aspirations? The second is to demand more from industry. Do companies today invest in their own workers? I was part of a large immigrant employment project that took place all around the province, and in one of our sessions, a federal representative sort of got up to give a keynote address, kind of a very right-wing person, by the way, and was demanding, asking what industry was bringing to the table. Not just sitting back and sort of saying we need a trained workforce, blah, 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 but really sort of seeking to engage industry in a much more proactive way. So how do we embed workforce training and development as part of the normal business process? We have a challenge in Canada, and this is sort of a Canadian-wide phenomenon, of being really poor investors in research and development, which affects our productivity and the quality of our economy going forward. Conference Board of Canada, in fact, gives Canada a D grade for research and development. And the poor grade is often attributed to Canada's heavier reliance on natural resource sectors that affects rural regions much more intensely. The phenomenon is true right across different business sectors in Canada, and we've been a D performer since the early 1980s. So, how do we best leverage the skills and commit to place in industry for a holistic rural development and a thriving workforce? And finally, demanding more from rural communities. You're all here this morning on a Monday morning. Our colleague David Douglas likes to refer to this as moving from case-making to place-making, which is don't just sit back and say we're important because, and you should invest in us because, and we matter because. Just get on with it. Just get on with the task of doing development, and you'll be that much better for it. Engagement in a rural and small town is your price for getting to live in a rural and small town place. If I have to live in a box in the city and travel an hour through 3 different modes of transportation to get to work, you can show up to a few meetings every once in a while. It's your price of living rural. It'll make me feel better anyway, knowing that you're going to those meetings. But it's true. I mean, we need to foster more of an investment mentality in our own community, something that I know that this community and this region have done a very good job at. Get engaged with planning processes and really sort of work to understand the complexities and interdependencies of rural development. So how will this workforce strategy engage regional citizens and workers? So in conclusion, I've placed a tremendous amount of burden on this talk around place and place-based development. There's a definition of it there. Thank you, academia, for that wordy piece of work. Is that actually mine, Ryan? It's me? Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry. Unique natural, physical, and/or human capacity endowments present within a particular. Anyway, you get the idea. But I think more powerfully is just simply understanding place as home, and that staying home in the 21st century and working and embedding yourself and working for the betterment of a community and region is actually a pretty radical thing to do in the 21st century when mobility surrounds us. The challenge in rural BC, which is not so much a challenge in this community and region as I look across to beautiful 19th century stone buildings, is that we haven't really built places of permanence, communities of permanence across the rural landscape. I like to refer to it as Anywhereville, rural British Columbia. Right, which is, if I blindfolded you all, put you on buses, drove across the province, scattered you all over the place, took the blindfold off, you'd be like, I have no idea where I am. There's nothing about this place that speaks to me about the quality of this place, the culture of this place. So we have work to do, again, not so much here, but in other areas of the province, to build places of true value and permanence. And place matters. Local assets are increasingly important for capital and people attraction and retention. Services that people expect are delivered in places. We govern ourselves locally, and importantly, our identities are formed in place, and commitment to place, which is such a fundamental ingredient to actually getting involved, right? If you love where you live, that 86% number for people that love living in the Kootenays, that is a fabulous platform for actually wanting to get involved and make the place better. So what does it look like? Well, new forms of collaboration, to be sure, place-based, not sector-based policy and programs. Again, let's think about that as we talk about clusters today. Bottom-up and top-down, but with an emphasis on communities and regions, I think really seizing control of the conversation and coming up with their own plans of where they want to go. Communities have to work better within regions, and we're going to need some new organizations, some new sort of institutionally resilient institutions that can help drive this. And again, the Kootenays are really far ahead on that respect. So let's, as we work on this project, let's think about what we're investing in. Sarah Breen produced a youth workforce study here a year and a half ago or so. She told me about one youth member of the community representing any number of youth in the region. She wants to stay. She's passionate about this place. She's done some local training, but is considering moving away for a higher degree, but wants to return, even if she goes away for a time. So how do we make that happen? How do we show her that she's worth investing in, and that there will be a place here and a future here for her in the region? You have considerable assets and institutions in this region. It's an exciting place to do this work. I hope everyone in the room feels the burden of responsibility and opportunity from that, because the work that you're doing, I think other regions of the province are going to be paying attention. They're going to want to know how it's working, and that goes true across the country as well. So with that, I have to go stop my family from purchasing everything in Oso Negro. Huge thanks to the Canadian Regional Development Project that Sarah and Heather and Ryan and others in the room all participated in. Thanks also to the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation for some of this material. The Rural Policy Learning Commons Project, which is a international project sort of sharing lessons and best practice on rural policy. I think we'll be paying attention to this project. You know the adage that academics are really good at asking questions, but communities want answers? Well, those are the questions that I have for you. But I'm prepared for the rest of the day to actually roll up my sleeves and answer them as well. So there's some really exciting things that we can have a conversation about today, and I'm really looking forward to working with you all today and going on with the project with Terry and her team as we figure this all out for the Kootenays. Thanks very much.